Good evening. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. We will have a few people, I'm sure, joining us as we continue. My name is Louise Halfpenny. I'm the Director of Communications, and this evening we are going to hear about cancer services. Here are some points about Zoom for this evening. I'm sure you're used to it now, but your microphone will be muted. We do ask that you keep your camera off for these sessions. That just helps with our bandwidth. And we ask you also to use the chat function to issue your questions to us. And you can do that as soon as you think of them. You don't have to wait until we finish talking, and send your questions, please, to West Herts Communications. Only the host will see your questions, and if there are two or three the same, I may paraphrase them. So please don't be offended. It may be that you've asked the same question as somebody else. It's important to tell you that the session is recorded, and that's really good for us because we want to keep this information and have it on our website so people who can't make tonight's session can catch up with it at a later date. The aims of the session are to give you an overview of our proposals, and particularly around cancer services this evening, and to talk a little bit about the engagement and share with you on how you can get involved. There will also be time for you to ask questions, so please do take that opportunity to talk to Dr. Anthony Leahy and to Claire Henshaw, who are the guests here this evening. So some of you will have been following this for a while, but here's a little bit of background for you. So this organisation, West Herts Hospitals NHS Trust, has been working with our partner Herts Valley's Clinical Commissioning Group, and we are working together to secure funding for major redevelopment for our three hospitals. So that's Watford General, Hemel Hempstead and St Albans City Hospital. In September 2019, the Prime Minister announced that we were one of 6 trusts to receive funding as part of a national programme called the Health Infrastructure Programme, which we sometimes call the HIP programme. And that is already changing its name a little bit to be called the New Hospital Programme, and there are now 8 frontrunners in the New Hospital Programme. So in order to receive our funding, we have to demonstrate to NHS England and NHS Improvement, as well as to the Department of Health and Social Care and the Treasury, that our proposal is really good value for money, it's affordable, and it can be delivered by 2025 or soon after. And that date's really important for us because if you've been a visitor or patient to any of our sites, you will know that our buildings really are in need of some serious investment. So our programme of public engagement is called Your Care, Your Views. A few years ago, you may remember there was a programme called Your Care, Your Future. And we've chosen a name that's similar because we want to indicate that there is a natural evolution from Your Care, Your Future, which looked very much at models of care that were closer to home. There was a lot of focus on moving services away from acute sites when patients could access them in community settings or away from the main site at Watford. So it follows on in line from that, but it also takes into account national strategy, and the documents that you can see there are our key underlying documents. And depending how much research you want to do, you can read our clinical strategy, our clinical brief, or to skim read. If you want a quicker read, there is a summary version of our engagement document, and all of this is on our website. So we use the phrase three's company because we don't believe three's a crowd. We believe 3 can get on very well, and we intend to make our 3 hospitals work much more effectively together. Our plans are really centred on having a unique purpose for every one of our 3 hospitals. A broad outline is for Watford to be the centre for our emergency, specialist and complex care, for St Albans to be the site for planned surgical care, planned cancer care and an urgent care service. So the urgent care service is something that we are planning for at the moment, and temporarily the minor injuries unit at St Albans is closed, and that's related to our response to the COVID pandemic. At Hemel Hempstead, we would want to provide care for people with long-term conditions and urgent services through the Urgent Treatment Centre and planned medical care. And we do not see Hemel Hempstead as having an inpatient service, so care delivered there would be on an outpatient basis. We would provide outpatient services at all 3 of our sites, but we do seek to streamline those and not to provide everything everywhere. So this slide is titled Consolidate, Not Duplicate, and really sets out how our approach will change the nature of the services provided at all 3 of our sites. We want to make the most of our teams and enable them to work together, not to be stretched across 3 sites, and also for there to be lesser risk of services being cancelled or clinics being cancelled due to staff absence or leave. We want our teams to enjoy working together, to have the right facilities on the right site. So that's really what's driving a lot of our decisions and a lot of our proposals that you'll hear about tonight. It does mean that the hospital nearest you might not always be the best hospital for you to go to. And out of our 3 hospitals, we want to make it really clear which one of those you should be attending for your care. So I'm now going to hand over to, I've forgotten already, is it Claire or is it Tony?
Claire.
It's Claire Hernshaw. And Claire, if you didn't just introduce yourself and say what your job is as well, that would be great. Thank you.
I will. Thanks, Louise. Hi there. My name is Claire Hernshaw, and I'm the Head of Cancer and Palliative Care. And I'm here with Dr. Tony Leahy, who will talk in a minute. I've got a few slides and then I'll hand over to Dr. Leahy. So we thought it might be sensible just to talk a bit about what we really mean when we're talking about cancer services. And the scope of what might happen from a patient perspective. So the first box there is about the diagnostic pathways. And this is the phase of a pathway where a patient is being investigated to see whether or not they may or may not have cancer. So classically, a patient will be referred in via their GP because the patient has gone to the GP with a symptom that they're worried about, and the GP may think that that constitutes something that might be something suspicious and might be cancer. And so the GP refers them in on one of about 12 pathways. And so, for example, that might be a lung, if you've been having coughs or whatever, a lung pathway, or a colorectal pathway, if you've had those sorts of problems. And then you come into the hospital and you follow a diagnostic pathway, which is managed by the hospital. And it's specifically managed by that group of clinicians and nurses who look after those types of problems, or patients with those types of problems. So the diagnostic pathway, and that goes on until either cancer has been excluded or it's been confirmed. And then obviously the patient will require treatment. And so within West Herts Hospitals Trust, we will treat patients, but it's also the case that sometimes patients will go outside of our trust to have some of their treatment, radiotherapy, some chemotherapy, for example, and maybe some specialist surgery will be done outside the trust, but a lot is done within our trust as well. Then after a patient has had treatment, up to the next box, the monitoring and follow-up sort of phase is also managed by our trust. And this might be very intense, and it may very well be that a patient requires more treatment after their first treatment, which is appropriate and hopefully supported. But it also may be that you're due back to come in for another scan in a year's time or something like this, with the instruction of what may or may not be to worry about in that time. So the monitoring might be very intense, or it might be less intense. And then some patients will need palliative care, Not everyone, and in fact, a lot of the services local to us are very keen to work with patients, whatever their prognosis. But we work with hospices and community teams for when palliative care is needed. So that's a sort of gambit of what we're talking about in cancer services. Next slide, please. So the next couple of slides are really talks about the NHS long-term plan and what is in there about what the nation's aspirations and ambitions, which are ambitious, what they are about around cancer. So just briefly, we're very keen by 2028 to dramatically improve cancer survival, and that will be largely done by diagnosing people earlier in their disease progression. There's also advances in precision medicine and individualized treatments. So that'll support cancer survival. And the next two slides are really about how fast or otherwise we can be in the diagnostic phase that I was talking earlier about, how fast we can be in getting patients through to the right tests, getting the results quickly, moving on to a clinical decision about what should happen next for that patient. And that will make a difference to patients' experience and their survival. Next slide, please. This talks a little bit more about the future milestones for cancer care. This is national. So there's talking about rolling out rapid diagnostic centres, and again, Dr. Leahy will talk a little bit more about that from a West Herts perspective. There's a new faster diagnosis standard which urges all trusts to be able to be in a situation where from the date of referral, when a patient is referred into the trust, to either excluding cancer or confirming it, the trust needs to do that within 28 days, and which is what we're aiming to do, and we manage to do that a lot of the time. We want to improve screening, including cervical screening, but also colorectal screening, breast as well. Making our treatments a bit more personalised and supported so that patients and families have the support they need through their treatment. And also making the follow-up pathways. Remember I was talking about the follow-up and the monitoring, making that very specific to individual patients so they're very clear about what to worry about and importantly, what not to worry about. Next slide, thank you. So these cancer care standards are something all trusts nationally are measured against. And although it is a target and it's a measure, actually we genuinely believe that these are really, really important to patients. So in fact, if we look at the bottom one on that slide, the bottom one is about that 28 days from date of referral to confirming or excluding cancer. The top bullet point is to, within 62 days, again, from the date of referral, that we start treatment, whatever treatment that is, surgery, radiotherapy, whatever it is, and wherever it is. We've got 62 days to diagnose and treat. And then the middle bullet point is another standard whereby no patient would wait more than 31 days from a decision to treat, to have a treatment, whether this is your first or any other treatment, and you wouldn't wait more than 31 days to start that treatment. So there's the standards. Next slide, please. So just sort of thinking about locally, back to West Herts, we've, as Louise has said, the three-site arrangement, a lot of it is historical, and a lot of all of those services, the lung team, the colorectal team, the upper gastrointestinal team, they're all over Watford, Hemel and St Albans at the moment. And so we've got this marvellous opportunity to design these so they work really well for cancer pathways, to speed them up and to make it much better and clearer for patients. So what we want to do, and which you may know already, but we want to build on the fact that every patient who is referred in on a cancer pathway from their GP is tracked by a team of administrators who track those patients, making sure that they get the right diagnostic at the right time. And we have clinical nurse specialists supporting the patients and their families as well. And we really want to build on that and provide a bit more support to patients into the future. And the role that Dr. Leahy and I and others do is try to support the specialities, the lung team, and as I keep saying, and the others, the head and neck team and others, in order to try and make those pathways work really very well. Next slide, please. And then just to say that we work very much in partnership with other people within Hertfordshire, other providers and commissioners and managers within Hertfordshire and West Essex, and also into London. Some of our pathways do go into London for some types of treatment. We also work with Mount Vernon Cancer Centre, which is 6 miles away, and they do all our radiotherapy and the majority, not all of our chemotherapy, but the majority of our chemotherapy too. Also, patients go into London for specialist surgery. They might go to the Royal Free or the Hammersmith, but they also might go to Lister and Luton. So there are quite a sort of network of pathways that patients follow. However, most diagnostics are done within West Herts. And Dr. Leahy will talk a little bit more about that, but most are done within West Herts. There are a couple of exceptions. It may very well be that patients need to go to the Paul Strickland Centre at Mount Vernon for PET scans, and there are a couple of other anomalies as well, but most of the diagnostics are done within West Herts. And I think I'll hand you over to Dr. Leahy.
Thank you, Claire. So my name's Tony Leahy. I'm a gastroenterology consultant, and I'm also the clinical director for cancer services at West Herts. This slide is a quote from one of my colleagues and friends, Freddie Banks. He's a urology consultant, but he's also the associate medical director of strategy. If I just read it, it gives you the gist of what we're trying to think about with cancer services. He said, that it can be a real challenge to reach a timely diagnosis because of the way our services are set out. Scans are in one place, outpatient appointments in another, a biopsy somewhere else, and maybe surgery at yet another location. And in between these appointments, there's a massive booking activity for us and travel and anxiety for the patients. So multiple sites for multiple things for single patients. He says, with the right diagnostic equipment and clinical teams in place at St. Albans, we can reduce the worry and the wait for so many patients. Next slide, please. Oh. So we have an opportunity to improve this, and in a second I'll talk about an example of the prostate pathway that we have at the moment. But at St. Albans, we're thinking of developing a rapid diagnostic centre. That's where you will have facilities such as scanners and endoscopies on site, and so that when that patient attends for their appointment, most of those patients will actually be found not to have cancer. But for some of the patients that will be diagnosed with a new diagnosis of cancer, we'll have all of the equipment and all of the people around that patient for that visit to try and make it a little bit easier for the patient and for the clinicians. So that's almost like a one-stop care. So you might, for instance, have an endoscopy test, find yourself got a tumor in the esophagus, and then you might be able to have your scan on the same day, and you'll have your clinical nurse specialist there to support you. And all of these sort of things are on one site rather than being fragmented on separate sites. It also gives us the opportunity to somewhat protect our cancer pathways from the sort of pressures that our acute sites often comes under pressure. And even at this very moment, we've got, like every hospital in the country, we have still a significant number of COVID patients in our acute site. And this has affected our planned care and arrangements for diagnostics and cancer. So we've had to think of other ways of looking after those patients during this current global pandemic, and that is also a problem for winter surges. So having elective services sometimes on an acute hot site isn't always the best thing, because they get sometimes impacted for those necessary patients. Next slide, please. So this is an example that Freddie Banks, I presume, chose. One of the things he looks after is prostate cancer. So if you're a gentleman my age, it's something that you might worry about, and you might attend Hemel Hempstead Hospital for an outpatient appointment. That's the first circle, number one. Then if you are diagnosed to have prostate cancer, you might require an MRI scan of the prostate, and those are currently performed at Spire Bushy because of capacity issues. Then if the MRI scan does indeed confirm prostate cancer, you might need a biopsy of that prostate. Then the patient goes back to St. Albans, where that service is actually currently provided. Then with the results of the biopsy, the patient goes for a follow-up clinic appointment, again at Hemel Hempstead Hospital. Mr. Banks sees the patient, thinks we just need to make sure that the prostate cancer is only in the prostate and nowhere else, so might organize a bone scan, which is a medical physics scan, to stage the prostate cancer. Again, that's at Watford Hospital. Then back for the results with the bone scan at St. Albans Hospital. And if indeed you might need a prostatectomy, and sometimes these are done by robots now, we have a robot at the Lister Hospital that does these operations for us. So a travel up north to the Hertfordshire. And then finally, if you need radiotherapy or other oncology treatments, off you go to the Mount Vernon Hospital. And finally, you end up back at Watford seeing your urologist. So as you can see, that one single patient has attended potentially 6 separate hospitals in their pathway. And bearing in mind, this is all over a 62-day period. That's a lot of traveling for our patients. And it does lead to a lot of fragmentation. So you can imagine how disjointed it is for the clinical teams to try to be looking after that single patient visiting so many separate hospitals. Next slide, please. So this is just an example of what the urology team might think might be achievable with a diagnostic center with relevant support services at St. Albans. So you go for your clinic appointment, your scan, your biopsy, your follow-up appointment, your medical physics bone scan, and then your oncology clinics, which are dovetailed to the urology clinics. So all of those appointments are in one place. So obviously the patient is familiar with that site. You have one clinical team coordinating all of those steps in that pathway, and they will still be required for specialized centers. So, the robot will still be at the Lister Hospital, and chemotherapy or radiotherapy will still be administered through Mount Vernon. But it reduces the number of sites that the patient has to visit substantially, and just makes it so much easier for the clinical team to look after that single patient. Next slide, please. There are also separate to this process, as you probably are aware, many discussions going on about the future of the Mount Vernon Cancer Centre. And I don't think it's a secret that it's been considered that the Mount Vernon Cancer Centre, for a lot of its services, does need to be relocated to an acute site. This is mainly to support patients for escalation purposes. So if the patients require specialist opinions, or require more critical support during their treatments. A separate review to West Herts did say that this really needs to be co-located to an acute site who could provide that that sort of support. And Watford has been highlighted as potentially the preferred site for Mount Vernon Hospital, but they're at very early stages. It has to go to a lot of further clinical and public consultation. So it's early days for those, but obviously the clinicians at Watford are excited about this possibility, as it does therefore bring the treatment centre into one sort of umbrella to West Herts. But that's something separate to what we're talking about today or this evening. Next slide. I think that's for you, Louise, is it?
Thank you. Yes, I couldn't get off mute there. So yes, this is just telling you how you can get involved. So we have all the documents that I've already showed you where they are on our website. So please, if you can make time, do have a read of those. And then there is a survey, and we'd be really grateful for people to get involved, to share the link to our survey, and that gives you an opportunity to tell us what you think about our ideas. We're also very happy to come out and talk to different community groups. So please, there's a email address at the end of these slides. Please get in touch if you're part of a community group and you want us to come out and talk to you. We absolutely will do that. And we do have sessions like this running for the next 2.5 weeks on a range of topics. So if you've got friends or family who are particularly interested in the model of care being provided at St Albans or at Hemel Hempstead, or children's care, or any other aspect, diagnostics as well, then please look at our programme of events and join us for another evening. And further information is on our website. So we do have time for questions, and there have been plenty that have come in. So thank you very much. There's a whole range. We'll try and get through them all. We don't always get a chance to answer everything, but we are saving all the questions. And at the end of our first period of public engagement, which ends on the 24th of March, we will make sure that we've gathered everything. And then when we come back out to the public after the local elections, we will give more rounded answers to any questions that we haven't been able to cover tonight. I'm going to start with one question that I can answer, and then I think, Tony, I'd like you to draw the distinction between cancer services at Mount Vernon and St Albans. But before I come to you, I just wanted to pick up a question about inpatient beds at Hemel Hempstead Hospital. So we currently do not provide inpatient beds at Hemel Hempstead Hospital. Those are provided by another organisation, and our core business is very much sort of consultant-led and clinical nurse specialist-led care. And so the model that we are looking at Hemel Hempstead is very much on an outpatient basis. And there are other organisations within Hertfordshire who very much are there to look after the intermediate care beds. So our view is that patients who are poorly enough to need to be admitted should be looked after at the acute site, where there is 24/7 medical care, and inpatient care for patients who are well enough to go home but not quite well enough to go back to their own home is part of the remit of another organisation. So we can't say at this stage whether or not there would be inpatient beds at Hemel Hempstead, but we can be clear that we wouldn't provide them. So that is something that the Commissioner and other organisations in Hertfordshire are going to be looking at over the next year. So in terms of our care, we do not provide inpatient care at Hemel Hempstead Hospital. So Tony, if I can come to you and ask you just to talk about the difference between the care provided to cancer patients at Mount Vernon and that we want to provide in this new way at St Albans, that would be really great. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, so Currently, Mount Vernon Hospital basically gives what we call the medical treatments for our cancer pathways. So that basically, in a nutshell, consists of chemotherapy and radiotherapy. Whereas what we're talking about, and that won't change, what we're talking about is possibly Mount Vernon Hospital locating onto an acute site, but it won't, I don't think, be physically part of that acute site. It'll be co-located onto an acute site, whereas St Albans will be more for the diagnostics pathway. So as I said, the vast majority of patients referred on these suspected cancer pathways don't end up being diagnosed having cancer. So there will be a rapid diagnostic center, which basically means that the patients will have their necessary investigations, often either direct access was one-stop visits to the patient, and also certain surgical operations. So St Albans has been highlighted to be the elective surgical centre as well, and that's something that our surgical colleagues are quite keen on, so that patients' beds and will not be cancelled on the day. So it's on a green site, it's on a cold elective site, so you won't have the difficult decisions of having to cancel patient surgery on the day or the day before because of inevitable bed pressures during pandemics and winter problems. So it is somewhat separate. St Albans will be diagnostics and cancer surgery, whereas Mount Vernon will be what they are specialist in chemotherapy and radiotherapy.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Claire, I'm going to come to you in a moment to answer a question about pathology, please. But I just wanted to pick up a question from somebody who asked if patients can choose where they go for their treatment. So your choice will be governed by the range of treatment available at each particular hospital. So the hospital that is closest to you might not be the hospital that can provide the treatment that you need. So if you have a long-term condition, say rheumatology, and you live in Watford, it is likely that you may need to travel to Hemel Hempstead. And if you require an endoscopy and you live in Hemel Hempstead, that is a service that will be moving to St Albans. So we are co-locating the services along the lines of the best clinical fit to give the patients the best clinical outcome. And so that will limit the choice, because we are, I suppose you could say that we are prioritising the quality and the safety of the care over the geography to some extent, because we want to bring our clinical teams together and we want to have the right diagnostic equipment at each hospital site. So that does govern the kinds of services that each site can provide. Claire, I wanted to ask you, if I may, a question about pathology. So how many of the pathways will involve pathology tests or samples, and how long will patients have to wait for results? Thank you. Thanks,
Louise. Well, I'm going to presume that the questioner is asking about biopsies. I'm hoping I'm right there. Pathology is quite broad, but I'm thinking that it's likely that the question is about having a biopsy, and the vast majority of these pathways are focused on having a biopsy, so that which will enable a sample to be taken from the area of suspected cancer, and then have further investigation under the microscope. And that's really important for all kinds of things, but particularly on how we get, whether or not it is a cancer and whether or not and how we're going to treat it. So the vast majority will have a biopsy somewhere in their pathway. And how long would one be expected to wait? We tend to reckon in between 7 to 10 days. So most people then have an appointment made within about 7 to 10 days for their results. Sometimes they're a bit longer if it needs to be sent off for a second opinion. Sometimes it's quicker, but that's about an average.
Thank you, Claire. Tony, I'm wondering if you can describe the difference between, well, I'll read the question out. It says, if you plan to provide services for long-term and multi-conditions at Hemel Hempstead, how does this fit in with cancer treatment at St Albans? So it's just distinguishing the different services at the two hospitals, please, if you could.
Yeah, so I think in Hemel Hempstead it's for long-term medical conditions, isn't it? Whereas St Albans is so that's the sort of the ongoing management of long-term medical conditions, such as you've just given the example, rheumatoid arthritis. But St Albans will be sort of more for patients with new symptoms, part of a rapid diagnostic centre. So I develop, I might have rheumatoid arthritis, but I develop problems with my swallowing and might need an endoscopy quickly. And if something's found there, have a scan and have different support services. So it's actually diagnosing new conditions, new diagnoses, some of which are cancer, whereas I think Hemel Hempstead will be managing the more sort of chronic long-term medical conditions.
Thank you. I've been asked a question about parking and parking not being very good at any of our hospitals, and I think we would all agree that it's not quite as it should be. So work on the multi-storey car park at Watford is underway and due for completion next year. It's only just enabling works that have started at the moment, but we expect that will make things much easier for patients coming onto the Watford site. St Albans is a site where we are slightly restricted by the size of the site, the footprint of the site. But I think it's important to say that we don't anticipate there being many, many more patients visiting the site. What we're aiming for is for each visit to the site to be more valuable for you as the patient. So you would come, you would have a diagnostic, you would get the result, you would then see a nurse or doctor or specialist. So it would be a longer appointment. So in some ways it should be less traffic because we are having fewer patients, but they would be there for longer, and also some inpatient and outpatient activity would move from St Albans. And it's worth saying that our aims include a reduction of up to 200,000 outpatient appointments every year. So that is less traffic because we do expect more people to transfer to digital modes of consultations, just using the same kind of technology as we're using tonight. And indeed, we have now treated around 4,000 patients through our virtual COVID hospital. So that will really reduce physical traffic on all of our sites. I just want to see if I've got any more questions. Tony, I think I'd like to ask you a question as a gastroenterologist here about the impact for patients on care pathways such as IBS, IBD and Crohn's, and maybe you could describe the future patient pathway, how it might change for those patients. Thank you.
So for non-cancer patients, those pathways might remain similar, the same. So currently, if you use those examples, inflammatory bowel disease, irritable bowel, there are outpatient clinics set at Hemel, St Albans and Watford, and I don't think there are any plans to reduce those clinics or sites at the moment. So there will be some outpatient activity continued on all three sites. But if you did have irritable bowel and you developed a symptom suggestive of bowel cancer, for instance, then you might you might then be referred to the Rapid Diagnostic Centre for an urgent colonoscopy or something like that. But I don't think your overall care for your Crohn's or your colitis would be really impacted on the things that we're talking about this evening.
Thank you, Tony. One of the documents goes into quite some detail about which services would be provided at which site. So if you were to look and you want to read more, the clinical brief is a really good document for understanding where the services would be provided from which of our 3 sites. So there has been a lot of thought into which services are provided where. And as Tony says, there will be some outpatient services that will remain common to all 3. So those most commonly needed, including antenatal services, those would be provided at all 3 sites. So although it's streamlining, it's not stripping out every outpatient service and making it only available at 1 site. Some will remain available at 2 or 3. But as I say, if you want more detail, the clinical brief is the document for you. Claire, I've got a question which you might be able to answer, which is about what's preventing us from implementing the new cancer pathway today. So you showed us lots of national ambitions, which I'm sure we would all aspire to. So what's stopping us from getting on with implementing those today?
We're implementing new things almost constantly. COVID has taken quite a lot of our energies recently, so one of the national ambitions is about the faster diagnosis standard, which we started quite early on, actually, when we first saw it coming on the horizon, and that was well embedded by 2020. Some of the other improvements which we are working on now will lend themselves nicely to our plans for St Albans. So if I give one example, we've been working in urology for patients who might have bladder cancer. To make a patient who might have bladder cancer may have 3 tests all in succession: an ultrasound, a cystoscopy, and a CT scan. And so we've already started bringing some of those on the same day. So the ultrasound is done on the same day as the cystoscopy, just to shorten the pathway, make it only one visit for the patient. And then if they need a CT and we're able, then we'd do that as well, but that may be on another day. So we are making progress to improve the pathways in readiness for the plans in 2025.
Thank you, Claire. So as we heard, diagnostics is going to be really important, and where we have the facilities also will guide where patients go, but it will make a huge improvement. So we're very excited to get our funding and to create better diagnostic facilities. And there is another session purely on diagnostics later in this series. I've got a question which might be a bit of a difficult one to answer, because it is how many MRIs are being proposed. Is there an answer to a question like that, Claire? I'm going to come to you first, but Tony, chip in if you've got an answer to that one. So how many MRIs are being proposed?
Again, I'm presuming they mean MRI machines, and at the moment, as opposed to scans, and at the moment, the proposal is 1, as I understand it. But I do know that there is national guidance about this, and it's under constant review. So I'm sure that the radiology teams and others will be following that guidance.
Thank you. I might ask, I did see that Esther Moores was with us earlier, and I don't know if she still is, but I was going to just, Esther, are you with us? Is it possible? Can I just double check that with you? Not doubting Claire, but just wanted to be absolutely sure on the question of MRIs. Thank you.
Yeah, so Claire is correct. The only thing I would add to that is, of course, we're always wanting to look where we would go next, because what we do know is that future demand for diagnostics is likely to continue to increase. So we are, as part of our plans for across a range of services for the redevelopment, looking at where would we go when we need more again, because we know that demand will continue to increase, and modelling when that might be.
Thank you. Tony, did you want to add anything onto that question?
No, I think Esther
Okay.
and Claire have answered it well.
Okay. In that case, I think we have come to the end of our questions. If anybody does have a question, then please, it would need to be. There is a question just come in actually about COVID preventing the cancer services meeting existing targets. So that is a really important question. We ought to address that. So there you go, Tony. I think that is one that I would like you to pick up. So the question is, how much is COVID preventing the cancer services meeting existing targets? And this is from somebody who's concerned that we've had to halt a number of services because of COVID. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I can partly answer this, and Claire might be able to because she's all over targets. But I mean, I think it's generally well known nationally that there's been an impact on cancer pathways. It stopped a lot of our diagnostics in the first wave of COVID, for example. All of the endoscopy units across the whole country were closed down basically because of the worries about risks of transmission. So if you're not doing diagnostics, you're not diagnosing your patients. And then there were separate challenges for surgery, because obviously hospitals around the country were for obvious reasons full of patients requiring treatment for their COVID pneumonias. So a lot of surgical activity was had to be sort of sidelined to hospitals in the independent sector. So I think everybody would acknowledge that the COVID pandemic sort of significantly affected cancer pathways like nothing, I think, that we've ever seen before. Claire, would you agree?
Yes, definitely, and it has been a real. It's been a very difficult time for a cancer patient and their family during this year. But I think what the Trust's view, we take, as previously said, the targets and the standards very seriously. But really, what we've been really focusing on is individual monitoring of these pathways to try and get people through, get them through their treatment. And I think the Trust has done jolly well, and the services have done very well overall in meeting the targets. But they have suffered as a result of COVID.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Tony, for those honest answers. I have one other question, which is about whether patients can get blood test results and then see a consultant as part of diagnosis and treatment. So I think our approach is very much along the one-stop model. So when we know that patients need diagnostics, we are trying to build as much as we can into one appointment, which is why the centre at St Albans is going to be so brilliant for us, because it will offer more rapid diagnosis, and then you can move straight on to see a consultant or a clinical nurse specialist. So where at all possible, we will be putting all of the steps in your pathway together to try and reduce your weight, your anxiety, and the amount of time you have to spend travelling to our sites. I don't have any further questions. They've been, every time I say that, a question comes in. So, and this is a good question, and Tony touched on it before we started the meeting, talking about Macmillan, and this questioner is talking about the information and the counselling and the complementary treatments that they can provide. So thinking about the service as we want to provide it at St Albans, Tony, could you just finish off by talking a little bit about the patient experience and how you think that might be better in our new model? Thank you.
Yeah, so this is very important, because what we don't want to be doing is making cancer diagnoses on our patients without the people around us that we need. So, and you know, that does sometimes happen if you're on fragmented multiple sites. So in the world that we see in the future is that if a patient comes to the rapid diagnostic centre, gets that new diagnosis of cancer, there will be a clinical nurse specialist around to come and support the patient and the clinician when they're breaking that bad news diagnosis. They will also then have an information centre attached to the rapid diagnostic centre, so the patient can have all the information that they want or require at that time. There will also be people who will then be able to organise whatever is required. We call them navigators. We're going to call them pathway navigators. So they will be able to organise those investigations. So, for instance, the patient might be able to be told what investigations they could either have on that day or return in the subsequent 1 or 2 days. So it's all there for them. And yeah, our lead nurse is very keen to have a more holistic approach. So for some complementary therapies as well as conventional treatment options available. So it's although we call it a rapid diagnostic center, it does have different facets. It's just not doing the test. It's actually pulling everything together, having this clinical nurse specialist, the navigator, the MDT coordinator, and the people who are ultimately going to give them treatments, whether that be complementary or conventional.
Thank you very much. And before I finish, I'd like to draw your attention to the QR code. If you use those, if you don't, you can find the link on our website to the survey. And if you can join us for any other sessions, tomorrow we have Mr. Simon West and Mr. Ben Rudge, and they are talking about the orthopaedic model at St Albans. Tracy Carter, our chief nurse, is with us on Wednesday. Thursday, we are likely to be talking about endoscopy. Friday, we are finishing the week with Mr. William Forson, consultant obstetrician. So really trying to cover the whole range of our services and more next week. I'd like to finish by passing on a thank you, which, although I try to have good manners and thank the speakers, I have to say that today's thank you comes from a member of the audience who simply wants to say thank you for all the work that you are doing, Tony. And I know, having done some fairly ragged on-call sessions with Claire, that she works her socks off as well. She might not be here as in a clinical capacity, but she's a pretty good problem solver on a tough and busy evening, as I know, to my advantage. So thank you, Tony, for bringing your insight and for giving us your time tonight. I know you're very busy, and Claire, thank you also. And to those of you who've joined us, thank you for your time. Thank you for your excellent questions. And please do keep following the series of meetings as we keep going for the next 2.5 weeks. Thank you very much indeed.